Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Paul Schnackenberg back on the show, and we are talking about another Microsoft security breach today, unfortunately. So there's been lots of security issues with Microsoft over the last year or two. This one's no different. This one is going to be talking about the recent breach of Microsoft executive emails by the threat actor known as Midnight Blizzard. So we're going to dive into this, what the attack chain looked like, kind of our commentary, what we think Microsoft should do, and lots more on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Well, everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornetsecurity. As always, I'm your host, Andy Syrewicze, and I've got, surprise, Paul Schnackenberg back on the show. How's it going, Paul?
Oh, that's a big surprise. I'm pretty good, Andy. How are you?
Doing good. Hey, there's just been so much Microsoft news, good, bad, and or otherwise, that you're my Microsoft guy, right? We always have great conversations whenever there's Microsoft stuff going on. So there's been no lack of news, and we've got another doozy of a news item to talk about today regarding Microsoft, don't we?
Yep, we do.
So
Midnight Blizzard has been up to their good old tricks, really. I think that's what it comes down to.
And of course, we had to give them the code name from the new, the new naming standard that Microsoft came up with. We're of course talking about Nobelium, right? That's what the threat actor group has historically been known as, but Microsoft has classified them as Midnight Blizzard moving forward. And of course, if you have not heard the news is that threat actors from the Midnight Blizzard have infiltrated Microsoft's corporate M365 tenant and exfiltrated executive team emails. That is the news item, right? But the more pressing question, of course, is like, okay, how, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think, Paul, maybe it starts, maybe our conversation about this starts by answering that question, right? Like, what is the brief overview of the attack chain for this? And of all the articles I've read through on this, basically the attack chain in a summarized form comes down to this. So there was and this kills me. This is like corporate doublespeak legalese here. It just grinds my gears. But there was a legacy non-production test tenant hanging around that surprise did not have MFA enabled on it, and the threat actors were able to essentially brute force the tenant using password spray attacks, right? If you're not familiar with the password spray attack, it's just, hey, I'm going to try a couple of common passwords against this account and this account and against this account. And the whole idea is you're only trying a few at a time, so you're not rising up on somebody's radar in terms of account lockouts and things like that. So this is done over a period of time. Anyway, they were able to essentially brute force the tenant using this. Once they were in this, again, non-production legacy test tenant, they then saw that there was an existing OAuth application out there that they then exploited to get the permissions needed to create additional OAuth applications, which they then used cross-tenant capabilities to use those OAuth apps to gain access into Microsoft's corporate M365 tenant, gave that one of those malicious OAuth apps the full access as app role, which we're going to get more into the details here in a few minutes. But that role essentially gives the app mailbox access, which they then use to siphon out all of the mail from the Microsoft executive team. Again, that's broad strokes, but that's basically what the attack chain looked like here, right? So I can't get past the corporate doublespeak on this one. The legacy non-production test tenant, it doesn't make it any better what happened, but I don't know. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, it really does not make it any better. And what comes to my mind is Microsoft speaks with a forked tongue. I think that's what you would have said over in your country there a few hundred years ago. Yeah. Um, we've talked about this before. I think that Microsoft's blog posts about when they've been compromised should be less legalese, less Brad Smith and his armies of lawyers over the whole thing. I get that they're a publicly traded company, and I get that their investors might get worried about them screwing things up. So let's plaster over it as much as possible. But look, it'd be better for everybody if they were just more transparent. I'd like Microsoft to
Yep.
lead in transparency when it comes to their revelations. The other point I
For
was going
sure.
to make is whether you call them Nobelium or Midnight Blizzard or any other name, what we're actually talking about is Russian espionage. So
Yeah.
this is SVR, the military spy organization in Russia, basically. So we're not talking about criminals. Well, I mean, they act like criminals, but they're not. They weren't after money. Like they weren't going to ransomware all of Microsoft's tenants.
Yeah, and they're
That would have been
probably
an interesting revelation.
right, and they're probably slightly better funded than your average cyber criminal. I'm just guessing, right? I'm going to go out on a limb
Maybe,
there.
although the cyber criminals, they are making money, man.
That's
We just
true.
saw Chainalysis came out, I think it was yesterday, day before yesterday. They estimate that ransomware earned $1.1 billion in 2023. So that's nearly double from 2022.
Right.
And the only reason it was so much double on 2022 is because 2021 was just shy of $1 billion. So the trend continued, except you had that little thing with the invasion in Ukraine, in 2022 that screwed up the statistics. But essentially, yeah, they're making money. So maybe they aren't as badly funded as you might think. I don't know.
That's true.
So, quick timeline here. So, it looks like this test tenant was compromised late November.
Yep.
Microsoft discovered the intrusion January the 12th, 2024, this year. And as we said, they were compromised by a password spray attack. And the reason Microsoft found it, just as a technical detail, was they were auditing their Exchange Web Services logs. So that's how they actually found what's going on. They're not alone. We know that HP, so HP Enterprise, HPE, has also been compromised by the same threat actor.
Right.
I haven't actually seen technical details there, so whether this was a similar method or a different method. I mean, it seems unlikely that they would have a handy test tenant hanging around with an OAuth app that has permissions in the production tenant, but maybe they did. Who knows?
Right.
I don't know. And what we hear from the industry, unconfirmed as so far, that there are tens of other organizations that also have been compromised in the same way.
Right.
So,
yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, Microsoft has been in the news in so many not great ways regarding security over the last year or two. I feel like lately, like the last 3-4 months, like every other episode you and I record is about some terrible security incident at Microsoft, right? For a while it was Storm 0558, and we talked about a smattering of others, right? But yeah, this is the new one, which brings me to our next talking point, and that is the response. And so many questions. I remember that when I saw news of the initial breach, the first 2 questions of my mind were like, why is this legacy tenant sitting out here? Like, what's its purpose, and why wasn't MFA enabled on it? And I mean, a lot of us in the cybersecurity industry were already making the prediction that, like, okay, this tenant did not have MFA on it before they confirmed that there was no MFA. You know, so I mean, that's problem one. But like, I think the question that's come up now, after the industry's had a chance to sit with this for a while, is like, where's Microsoft's red team? How was this not discovered, right? I mean, right? How is it not discovered?
I don't know. This was exactly my thought as well. Now, just as a full disclosure here, I'm not a red teamer. I'm not a pen tester. So there's a bit of armchair pen testing going on here, if such a thing
Right.
exists. But but from all the presentations I've listened to and people I've talked to who work in that industry, like one of the classic, like your 18-year-old starting out in a bug bounty program, doing some early pen testing in their career, going, I wonder if they have any other tenants registered, right? Like any other domains registered, because often developers will spin up stuff. They'll have some sort of side tenant that they use for testing before it's brought into production, and they don't get the same attention, and they often aren't as isolated as people think, right? People think, oh, well, that's a completely separate environment. If that gets compromised, there's no production data, there's no PII, there's nothing in there, right? Well, as it turns out in this case, that's not quite true always, right?
Right.
So that's what people go after. I mean, that's what I would go after if I was tasked with trying to find some, because the main production tenant is very well guarded. Like everybody knows that this is the one that the bad guys are going to go after, right? So you look at the other ones on the side. Is there something here that we can use? So yeah, that's. And even the fact that Microsoft, they don't just have an internal red team that I would assume would have gone after this thing, but they also hire external pen testing companies. I mean, as part of their compliance regulations, so that they can be, have all the ticks they've got on all their compliance that they adhere to, both for Azure and Microsoft 365 and Dynamics 365 and all that. And those people have also not gone after this test tenant, which somehow makes me think that there is a scope issue. Just like we said with the Storm 0558 breach, there is a scoping issue where when you get hired as a pen tester or you're an internal red team, right, there's a scope of what you can do and you can't do, right? Like if you really wanted to compromise, not Microsoft, but some smaller organization, you could kidnap the IT administrator and hold his family at gunpoint or something, right? Like that. Bad guys might do that in a really bad scenario, but as a pen tester, you can't really do that, right? That's out of scope. But this seems like this should have been in scope.
Right. And I mean, the other, I think back to all the various projects that I used to do when I was in the trenches. Scope always comes up, right? Because like, hey, what's the scope of this project? And I mean, maybe Microsoft themselves didn't even include this, again, non-production legacy test tenant in their scope. Maybe they didn't tell the pen testers about it, right? Because
I think so.
And it could be entirely the case that whatever team was in charge of this test tenant, maybe that OAuth app wasn't even intended to be there. I have to believe that this tenant, when they put it out there was no intention for there to be any sort of, cross tenant integration, at least something, not anything that's persistent, right? Which brings us to a different point that we're going to talk about later, how, apps have persistent access into Entra ID. We'll get to that, but that's a whole other thing, right? But when we talk about their response, right, Alex Stamos, a very prominent security figure in the community, had some very strong words, warranted strong words. And I'll link the post in the show notes. But one thing he mentioned kind of really stuck with me. Again, I've said it several times, non-production legacy test tenant. He made the point that any organization, Microsoft included, not only has a responsibility to secure their production systems, legacy systems are a part of that equation. They have a responsibility to secure legacy stuff as well. And in this case, this legacy test tenant. So, I mean, that obviously is a lacking part in their response. And the one big thing, and you and I have talked about this before when we were talking about the Secure Future Initiative a few episodes ago, Paul.
Yeah.
Where's Satya? I mean, just no... we talked about this last time, was where it's gotten to a point with the security stuff recently that there needs to be some big showing from the CEO of the company. And there just isn't.
Hmm.
Your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I still think this is weird. This is weird. Like, I think Satya is a great CEO. I've never met him, but I've seen him on screen many, many times, obviously. And he certainly has propelled Microsoft to be the world's most valuable company.
Yeah.
So from a purely capitalist point of view, he's doing all right. And I think from what I hear from people that I know that work at Microsoft, they're very happy with the leadership.
Yeah.
But I do think this is a weird one. It is a weird one because it sort of tells me that we're having big security issues that compromise stuff. And so that I don't forget this, I will point out that as far as we know, and we'll talk about who came up with all of this and where we get these technical details from, but as far as we know, this was not just, hey, we compromised the executives and the legal team's mailboxes. This was a complete global admin, full access to Microsoft's production tenant. Like they had full access to everything. As far as we can tell, again, we don't have the technical details yet, but as far as we can tell, that's what this is. And to me, both with this and the Storm 0558, you want the head of the company, the CEO, to be publicly stating, hey, this is what happened, this is what we have done about it, not his underlings. And it sort of tells me that it's still not, Microsoft does still not see this as an existential threat. And I think trust is difficult to regain, especially when you keep losing it over and over again.
Right.
Now, if you want to be really cynical, if you want to be really, really cynical, you could say, and this would, I hope this is not the case, but it could be that Microsoft knows that in many areas, like if you're the US government, it's not like you have a choice, right? Like it's not like you can say, hey, we're just going to kick Microsoft 365 out the door and we're going to go to Google, because that's just not an option. Which means that maybe the lack of CEO response is simply that they know that people don't have a choice. But I think that's a really bad place to be, if that's where they're coming from. But who knows?
Right. Oh, that's an interesting one.
Well, and an interesting point here, when it comes to data breaches in general, not just with Microsoft, but with everybody. Troy Hunt, a fellow Australian here, he has a weekly podcast and lots of stuff. Have I Been Pwned? You might have heard of. Fantastic service, free service. He said, and obviously he's dealt with a lot of data breaches, right? Because he gets a lot of data breaches reported to him for Have I Been Pwned. He's then disclosing to companies going through the motions of how do they disclose to their users, etc., etc. And he always says that if, as an organization, you don't take control of the narrative and actually tell people honestly and straight up what happened, then other people are going to fill that space. And they're going to fill that space with speculation, which is why we're trying to get into the head of the CEO of the most valuable company on the planet, trying to figure out why he's not doing this. Whereas if they just took it seriously enough, we wouldn't have to speculate. There wouldn't be any question, because he'd be telling us exactly how he sees it and what they're going to do to fix it, you know?
For sure. And I get the fear of wanting to disclose this information, and the fear of disclosure was so evident in that the initial disclosure happened late on a Friday evening. You know?
Oh yeah. So that's just it stinks, I think.
It really does. It really does. I mean, people are going to find out anyway. Why not just be upfront and honest about it? But anyway.
Exactly.
So moving on to our next point here, kind of diving into some of the architectural details here. There's one thing that you wanted to talk about, Paul, and I think this is great when we talk about this from the scope of this attack, is just kind of explaining an OAuth app and a service principal. Those are two very key terms for this conversation. And before you go into your explanation, I will say that you and I did an episode specifically about malicious OAuth apps. I will include that in the show notes as well, folks, in case you want to take a look at that. But I'll let you take it away on the OAuth apps and the service principles there, Paul.
Thank you. Fabulous. Now that was a great episode. It's a few years old, but everything we said is still applicable. So well worth revisiting that, because is that a podcast or a webinar? Did we do demos?
So we did a webinar a few years ago on it, but then the podcast I just mentioned, that is, I want to say 4, maybe 5 months old as of the time of this recording.
Okay, so maybe link to the webinar as well. The webinar is also a few years old, but it has some good demos and it's well worth looking at. Okay,
for sure.
So first of all, we want to give credit where credit's due. There will be a link in the show notes for a video, a 1-hour YouTube video with a guy called Andy Robbins, who is an Entra ID / Azure AD expert, and he goes through the whole sentence by sentence of Microsoft's blog post of what happened, and he breaks it down as much as is technically possible to understand what each step meant, right? And then he gives a demo, like he has 2 tenants and he creates OAuth apps and he links them up and explains why this has to happen here and this has to happen there. So for those of you who are old-fashioned IT administrators, we used to have Active Directory. We still do. It's on premises. When you have an application on premises, there is no registration. Some applications, notably Exchange, but I suppose there were a few third-party apps as well, will actually add fields into the schema of Active Directory. But most applications just run on your servers and they have nothing to do with Active Directory except signing in as an account or a service account to run a database or something, and that's it, right? So one of the benefits we got from a security point of view when we moved to the cloud and to Entra ID is that because it's built on the open authentication standard or OAuth standard, we now get the fact that any application that should have access to any data in your tenant has to register. So you could have your own app that you create, which is a single tenant app that just has access to data in your tenant. Once you give it permissions, it's got access to that. But then you have multi-tenant apps, and that's sort of what we're talking about here. So I'll use an example here, Hornetsecurity, Microsoft 365 backup solution. When you install the trial of that, you get a consent screen that says, hey, this application needs access to your tenant because it needs to back up mailboxes and SharePoint sites and everything else, right? To get access to that, it needs permissions. So it lists a whole bunch of permissions. And as an administrator, you can now consent to those permissions. End users can, depending on how you set up your tenant or how you've changed the default configuration, end users can also do this, right? So Jane in accounting can install an app in Outlook that helps her with calendar bookings. When she does, she will get a consent screen that asks, hey, I need access to your mailbox, maybe read access to your calendar, say, like as an example.
Right.
And she consents to that. You could also configure your tenant so that she can't consent to that, and she clicks a button, and then an administrator has to go in and look at it and say, yep, this is an okay app, it's not malicious, I'm going to allow that. So when you do that, the multi-tenant app, so in Hornetsecurity's Entra ID tenant, there is a Microsoft 365 backup application. When I, in Contoso, install the trial of that, then I get a service principal show up in my tenant. So when I go and look under app registrations, I see a service principal. That's sort of like an instance or a link back to that application. And the important thing to understand here is that that's normal OAuth. This is exactly how OAuth is meant to work. Yep. Anybody who knows this, even outside the Microsoft world, will say, yep, that's exactly how it's meant to work, right? No question asked there. However, what you have to realize is that in the old world, in Active Directory, you could have a merger and acquisition with 2 different Active Directories. And if you weren't going to siphon off all the users from one Active Directory forest and put them into another one. You had to link them. So you created a forest trust between them. Now, that required actual networking because they had to actually have the servers in one data center talk to the server in another data center. Today, of course, there is only one Entra ID. Like it's one Azure Active Directory planet-wide directory that has hundreds of thousands or millions of tenants inside of it. So when you say, I trust Hornetsecurity's application, and remember, we're just using this as an example here, I am now penetrating that trust boundary. So I'm now adding an application into my tenant that has a lot of permissions, right? Like this, literally, like if vendor X and I approved their application into my tenant and they turned out to be malicious, they have whatever permissions that application that I gave it to, right? In this case, read all people's mailboxes and write back to people's mailboxes when you're restoring email, for example.
Right. And I think the key thing here,
to be aware of.
And maybe you're getting to this, Paul, the key thing here, though, is that it's persistent, right?
Yep.
After this connection has been made, after the application has been allowed by the administrator, the end user, whatever, it's persistent. It doesn't matter anymore, usernames and passwords. The app itself has access into the tenant.
Yep. So as far as this particular breach goes, the steps that were involved between late November and 12th of January, they would have had to create a user. Then they would have had to create an application. Then they would have to give consent to that application. Then they had to assign the app role assignment that you talked about, the full access to mailboxes. And then they would have had email inbox access. Now, remember, they were spying, and that's what they were after. But as far as we can tell, they had full unfettered access like global admins to everything. So, now let's see. The next thing we want to talk about, and there is, so I mentioned this whole thing about the admin in the tenant that's using the application has to consent, right? You get the consent screen, you got to click the button. There is actually one permission in the API, which is the app role assignment read write all, that does not require that. And that's how we think that they probably got around this, because the other scenario is that they had to either create a user that had enough permissions to go into the portal and click the approve button, which is possible but unlikely. I suppose the third scenario is they bribed somebody at Microsoft, but they'd have to find one of the very few administrators to actually go in and consent to the application. I think that's highly, highly, highly unlikely.
Oh, man. You mentioning that just made me stop and think for a second. Can you imagine being the person that has to think about Microsoft's risk profile across all of their services? Anyway, that's a whole other conversation, but
that is a whole other conversation.
Wow.
Anyway, what we do probably want to get to here is watch the video, read the blog post, much more technical detail on how you can look at this. And obviously in a podcast, we don't really have the communications medium to actually go into those details. But I do want to talk about what admins need to do. All right. So if you're worried about this for your tenant now, if you're a 5-person company, you probably don't need to worry about the Russian SVR coming after your tenant. But that doesn't mean that somebody else mightn't, right? It's a nice way of getting compromised. So what you need to do is you need to look at all the foreign apps, so apps that are not coming from your tenant. So they show up in your tenant as a service principal. And you want to look at what permissions do they have. You want to do an audit. You want to go in and look in the Entra ID portal and look through the ones that have the high risk permissions. Now, sometimes, and I know this is shocking to all the developers listening to me, but sometimes developers will actually ask for more permissions than they actually need. Right?
No,
rather than go through
happens.
and actually figure out exactly what they do need for their app to run, they just say, "Hey, if you just give us global admin, this thing runs like nobody's business. It's like a Lamborghini. Just give us global admin, and it's going to be great."
So
So what you want?
I need to stop for a second and just apologize to any developers that are listening.
Oh, I
but,
apologize
but
too. I
but you know
apologize.
what? You guys do that.
Mhm.
Just for the record, Anyway, continue.
Well, it works. It's the old classic. It works on my box. So, anyway. Um, so, where you can, you want to remove permissions. And obviously, for new applications, when the vendor comes and asks for everything under the sun, you might push back and say, oh, hang on, do you really need all these permissions? For existing apps, you want to inventory all the ones that have scary permissions, right? And
Yep.
where you can, you want to remove them. So you can actually look and see what permissions has an application actually used. Then you can match it up what they asked for, and you can say, well, hang on, you asked for 10 and you're only using 6, right? Can I remove these other 4? Now, in the scenarios where you can't actually remove those permissions, you do want to understand the risk. Like, this should not be an invisible thing that Johnny, the IT admin, looked at last year and has forgotten about. This should be documented in your risk register, right? Like,
Right.
we have the following 15 apps in our organization's tenant that are have high permissions. We have vetted them as best we can. We trust the vendors as much as we can. But if any of those vendors get compromised, we need to immediately go and deal with this, right? We can't just let that slide. It shouldn't be, oh, it's part of the infrastructure, I'm sure it'll be all right. You know what I mean? Let's pretend that it's not an issue. So you want to understand those risks. Now, to do some of that auditing, and I just mentioned this as it's a funny thing, Andy Robbins, in his video, he goes through using the developer tools in the browser to capture JSON payloads, so you can see the object IDs of what was requested, and then you go and match that manually with what API and what permission that is actually doing. So it would be great, Microsoft, if you could have some better tools. And that leads to my last point. Azure Active Directory Entra ID is hard. It is a
Right.
hard, complex platform. Big organizations can have experts to try to work through this and keep up to date with the changing landscape, because it changes a lot faster than Active Directory ever did. But for small to medium organizations, Microsoft has always had a habit of trying to hide the complexity, right? Which is why they have had such popular products for the last 35 years or something, right? They hide the
Right.
complexity. If you want complexity, you can, install Linux or something. And now we've offended all the Linux users as well. Developers in Linux, thank you. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Sorry to see you go. We do apologize.
We've chased off half our audience now.
I do apologize.
It is a
But
security podcast, so maybe more than that on the Linux
could
side.
be more. Could be more. I'm really sorry. But the point is, they do try to hide the complexity. And I think in this case, they need not to hide the complexity too much. They need to give us tools so that we can manage that complexity, because it is a complex beast. The example that I always give is the Bing Bang that Wiz uncovered about a year and a half ago, something like that, where a multi-tenant app, exactly what we're talking about here, had been wrongly configured. The Wiz penetration team got access to it in Microsoft's production tenant, got to the configuration portal for Bing search results, and changed the favorite soundtrack to the hackers from the 1980s movie, which I thought was very funny. So when even Microsoft misconfigures things like that, then we do need to be aware that ordinary time poor administrators who are generalists, who are trying to juggle 50 different plates at the same time, they're going to have a hard time securing this thing, and that's an important thing to know. Rant over.
That was a good rant. I think it's a valid rant. This brings up another question, and you and I have talked about this a little bit in the past before too, is that at what point does the speed and scale that we're moving with cloud services negatively impact security? Personally, I think we've already gone way past that line, in my opinion. And that brings me back to Alex Stamos again, the guy I mentioned earlier. One other thing that he said at the end of his rant really stuck with me, and that is the fact that Microsoft should probably, I'm paraphrasing here, but Microsoft should probably stop looking at security as a profit center. And I think I agree with that. I mean,
It's an issue. It's an issue, and it's an issue because Microsoft is now a really, really big security vendor. They sell a lot of security products. Those security products are really good. I'm using them at my clients. I wouldn't use anybody else. I'm very happy with them, but in some cases, they are solving problems in the underlying platform that one could strongly argue Microsoft should have fixed in the first place, right? Rather than sell you a tool on top of it. And we've heard lots of analogies, like it's like the car vendor. They sell you the car and then they go, oh, did you want brakes and seatbelts? That's extra, like it's not exactly how it should be. And in some cases, this is true. Some cases, it's probably a bit unfair when all the other third-party vendors is charging for it, and we go, "Oh, Microsoft, you shouldn't charge for this." But in some cases, definitely fixing the underlying platform would make the security product that fixes that particular issue not necessary. So,
right. And the other way I look at it, and I've said this on the show before too, I think, is the fact that when you are a vendor that provides a platform, Azure, M365, whatever, and you're doing it for customers that are hosting sensitive information, sensitive workloads on that platform, to be honest, there probably should be a impartial third-party company that is doing security in that case, right? Because I mean, this is not a Microsoft specific issue, but I would think it's a conflict of interest for any organization, any company in this situation where the negative impact of one product could be a detriment to the sales of one of their other products, right? In this case, a failing of a Microsoft security product could negatively impact, for example, the sales of 365, right? I mean, it's a conflict of interest. And I mean, anyway, I'm all for independent third party, obviously,
it makes a lot of sense. And I think probably that point about things moving too fast. I mean, that's one of the things they said in their blog post. This tells us we should move faster. I'm like, no. You should slow down. What you should do is not move so fast. You should slow down and look to make sure you got your fundamentals right before you start running off into Copilot and AI land. But I do also think that this ever-changing underlying platform, I think, is another, we'll tease it here for another podcast episode. I think we're going to have another conversation about that.
Definitely. There's a lot we can talk about that. But yeah, I think we're about out of time today. So no time to talk about that one today. But Paul, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing your knowledge and insights. I imagine, just like we did with the Storm 0558 situation, I get the feeling that you and I are going to be talking about this again in the near future in some way, shape, or form. So
there'll be more information coming out of Microsoft for sure. Like this seems to be the pattern. A short blog post, then a long blog post. It still doesn't tell you all the details, and then eventually we get the technical details. So
someday. Eventually, it'll happen. So anyway, always good talking to you, my friend. Thanks for being here.
That was great. Thank you.
Definitely. And those of you watching, thanks for spending some time with us today. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. Otherwise, we are available on all the major podcasting platforms, so chances are you can listen to the show wherever your preferred platform is. With that, we'll let you get back to your day. I hope you enjoyed the show. Looking forward to seeing you again next week for another episode. Until then, stay safe out there. We'll catch you later.